Welcome to Dark Facade, a channel dedicated to looking past the veneer of humanity and finding its true face. I will be your tour guide down this winding path of tales, ranging from the supernatural, science fiction, and twisted love. All the stories you're about to hear are assorted bits of literature that will range from the bizarre to the unexpected. So sit back, lower the lights, and allow yourself to be taken away from everyday reality to its shadowy reflection. If you enjoy our unusual content, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to receive more. Thank you. Welcome back to Dark Facade. This is Bastian and Lucia, Part 11. Bastian shook his head before exiting the king's chambers. He would not be there when his father passed, not even if he summoned him. He had no love for the old fool now, and no love for his kingdom. As he headed towards his tower, he made another decision. The one he did love had only a precious few hours left. He would spend that time with her, and God help anyone who stood in his way. His heart pounded in rage and pain the deeper he descended into the gloomy depths of the dungeon. The closer he got to her cage, the more angry he became. Why hadn't she fought harder? She just stood there and let them bury her. Did she love him at all? He was starting to wonder. He was suffering the twisted pain of a tortured heart. By the time he reached her cell, his simmering ire was now rage. When the jailer saw him, he offered up no resistance to opening her door. After it was shut securely behind him, Bastian ordered him to step away and not return until the dawn. Lucia sat up from her straw cot and smiled at the sight of him. The fire in his eyes grew to irate heights at the happiness in hers. How could she be so cheerful? How could she feel anything other than fear or sadness? Didn't she understand what was happening? The joy on her face soon faded when she saw the anger on his. He paced the cell as he glared at her with a heart full of resentment. He felt betrayed and tricked and forced into making her pay. He was supposed to hate her. He was supposed to rejoice in her impending demise. If only he could. He watched her, sitting over there in her shadowy corner, staring back at him with neither shame nor fear. She didn't even have the decency to cast her eyes down, if not in regret, at least in humility. Her actions had cost them everything. "Do you realize the position you've put me in?" he asked bitterly. "Do you even care?" "I did what I had to do. Now you do what you must," she answered calmly. "What I must," he repeated sardonically. She stared at him in silence. "I can't intercede on your behalf. I can't stop this. You've tied my hands," he yelled. This time she did lower her eyes. "Have you nothing to say? Nothing at all!" His voice was beginning to crack under the pressure of his heartbreak. "Every choice has its consequences, my lord. I knew when I made this one of the potential ramifications I would face. I accepted them then, just as I'm prepared to take them now," she replied quietly. "Why? Why did you do this? Why did you conspire against me, against them? Why did you drag Dominic into it?" he cried. "Dominic is innocent. He knew nothing and did nothing wrong. I would never endanger him, nor take someone so precious to you away." His eyes narrowed in anguish. "You've already done that," he replied mournfully. Who have I taken?" she asked, confused. "You," he declared as he cupped her face in his large hands while tears streamed down his own. She regarded him dismally. "Oh, yes," he murmured painfully while leaning his forehead against hers. "I love you. Oh, how I love you." The weight of the situation finally bore on her hard enough that she broke down and joined him in sorrow. I can't even mourn you. I cannot show sadness when you die. I must stand tall, my face an iron mask, as your life ends before my eyes. To show any such emotion will be seen as weakness or sympathy for the enemy. You have made yourself my enemy, and by doing so, have robbed me of my grief." Her heart swelled in sympathy and regret. "Then grieve for me now, my lord, where only you and I will bear witness. Please, since I'm the cause of it, let me ease your suffering." She took the hand that signed her death warrant and kissed it softly. "Come," she beckoned, "come hold me, as you've wanted to do for so long." His towering form collapsed in her embrace, where he wept as long and hard as St. Peter after his Lord's crucifixion. The shadows of her tomb seemed to stretch the length of the world, for in truth, was that not where she was? A world away, a place beyond the dim confines of her crypt, where death, the greedy creature that it was, slowly ravaged her flesh to bone. He had managed to witness her execution with barely a tear, but just barely. After spending the night in her soft embrace, he believed he had none left. Yet as he sat in his place of power and watched her sentence be carried out, his heart simply couldn't bear all the burden. He closed his stone-colored eyes at the sight of the darkling sucking her life away. As he did so, a single tear slid down his stern face. Though it would not do for those seated alongside him to see such a reaction, he couldn't make himself care. In a moment she would be dead, lost to him forever. As he watched her body fall lifeless to the ground, he wondered, what good is it to rule, if one must rule alone? He had insisted on watching the death maids prepare her for burial before laying her to rest within his tomb. He had done this not for the hateful reasons the ruling class believed, but for himself. He needed to say goodbye. He needed to mourn. Her final words to him echoed in the sound of the closing of the crypt door. "I forgive you." Well, perhaps she did, but he never would. Only now, as he stood in the gloom of their death house, did he understand what a slave he and all the kings before him had become to their position. Power truly was a harsh mistress. They had desired her so much that they betrayed their own hearts to keep her. The distinct sound of weeping disrupted his bitter reverie. He looked about to see from where it was coming. The voice of the mourner was one he knew, but strangely could not quite place. He followed the somber heartbreak to its source, where the identity of his fellow bereaved became known. There in the darkest corner of her crypt door was his beloved familiar, Dominic. The youth was so overcome with sorrow he was on his knees with his hands placed firmly against the heavy iron and wood passageway. The wizard only stood a moment more, listening to the poor creature's anguish, before he spoke. "Dominic," he called softly. The young man only turned to look at him for a moment, his eyes swollen with inconsolable grief. "Master," he wailed, "the pain is terrible. Please, put me out of my misery." A sympathetic smile covered Bastian's face as he watched the terrible suffering before him. The fact was, the familiar's pain was not lost on him. He understood it quite well. Yet Dominic's heartbreak was much worse than his own. He was enduring the lost love of youth, the sort that results from being smitten for the very first time. Oh, the sweet euphoria it brings, and the horrible pain when it all comes crashing down. The youthful heart believes it shall never recover, nor ever love again. "Come now, my lad. We should head for home," Bastian said as he gently lifted him to his feet. "Your house is no longer my home," he spat while jerking his arm away. "Dominic," Bastian snapped in an attempt to regain control over his magical servant. "Your power over me is obsolete. Her blood made it so." the familiar declared, with his back pressed firmly against the stone wall. The wizard regarded his magical charge in complete surprise, not just because of his revelation, but because the Blood Witch had fulfilled her prophecy. She had told all of them during her inquisition that change was coming to their realm, whether they liked it or not. The bond that chained Dominic in servitude to him was now broken. This was one of the reasons Sanguines had been outlawed from these lands, and one of the many reasons she was destroyed. Lucia had bested them all in the end, him especially, for he would not only suffer her loss, but Dominic's as well. He stared into the young man's deep green eyes, which were now more cat-like than human. "So what are you going to do?" Bastian asked. "Do?" the familiar echoed in confusion. "With the rest of your life, Dominic. She laid the world at your feet. You are at last free to explore it. Where will you go, and what will you do?" his master asked. "What I've wanted to do since the first time I saw her face. Follow her wherever she goes," he replied mournfully while resting his head against the door. "Really, what a disgraceful waste of her blood and sacrifice. She should not have squandered them on you," Bastian said with complete disdain. "Who are you to judge me? You and your archaic council murdered her. You're the reason she's locked away in this tomb where only time and death may touch her now," Dominic cried accusingly. "It was your testimony that damned her, was it not?" Bastian's hateful truth deepened his guilt and darkened his gaze. "Yes, I am guilty, but my trespass was unintentional. Yours was not," he glared. Bastian met his hostility with a bitter smile. "Once they discover what you all have done to one of Merrick's own, they'll come for you. Your kingdom will fall, just as it should," Dominic spat vengefully. "If all comes to pass as you have predicted, if Alexander comes with his legions to destroy us, then know this: in the end, it will be me that is laid to rest eternally by her side, not you." Though there was spite in Bastian's voice, there was none in his eyes. At that moment, Dominic could plainly see his regret, his guilt, and his pain. They were no longer master and servant, nor bitter adversaries. They were two men who had loved and lost. Though it was hard for him to set aside his anger, he briefly did. He did for the sake of all those years his master had been kind and never once hurt him, as other wizards and witches did their familiars. The cruelest thing he had done was put Lucia in a crypt. As he looked into Bastian's face, he realized the wizard was also a slave. He was a slave to his position. Alexander's sword would be a kindness, for he would be free at last. He would be free to love the one he should have saved. "So be it then," Dominic declared as his angry, broken heart reclaimed his conscience. "I will leave your kingdom. I will go out into the world, and I will return with the Wolf King and his legions. I will honor her sacrifice by avenging her death, and in doing so, I will set you free." Bastian stared into the fierce eyes of his young apprentice, then shook his head. "Yes, so be it," he replied softly, as his gaze shifted to the door that would become his way out and lead him back to her. As he walked from the shadows to the moonlight, he wondered, was he any better than Dominic? He had just chastised him for wanting nothing more than to die so he could be with her again. By sitting back and doing nothing to stop him from bringing Alexander to their door, was he not doing the same thing? He could imprison the familiar, even kill him, but he didn't want to. No, he wouldn't do that. He had spilled enough innocent blood tonight, and he would shed no more. In truth, he was tired. He had lived a long time, and frankly, Lucia's death had finished him. Bastian knew the minute she had been arrested and put before the inquisitors that it was unjust. What had she done that was so terrible? Broken their archaic laws? Laws that were becoming obsolete everywhere in the world around them. Perhaps that was why they were so quick to kill her and any of her kind they encountered. Her blood represented change, a change that would make them primitive relics from a bygone era. He laughed bitterly as he realized the harsh reality of it all. They were old fools, hanging on to old traditions that were no longer relevant. As he entered his home and was immediately fussed over by several servants tending to his every whim, he heard her in the back of his head. "What good is having power if you do no good with it?" "It is useless, my dear," he murmured to her memory, "completely useless."